Hi, I'm Iqbal. I'm with Nano Digital Home Loans, now Nano Lending Solutions, and this is my talk about HTMX. It's called HTMX All Things, and with some caveats, of course. And the caveats are that maybe you shouldn't use HTMX for all the things. Let's continue. Right. So over here, we're looking at basically the interplay between, a server and a client inside, old school style where you used to have RESTful type primitives. You had a page, you kind of like submit a form. The form gets processed on the server redirects and basically serves another page, and then you correspond and you kind of like go action by action until you get your outcome, which might be placing an order on a shopping cart. Now, this is the old way of doing things. And in Django, this is what it would look like. You would have, the definition of a form. Let's just assume for the sake of this discussion that the form just has one field called color. It could be red, green, blue, whatever. Then, it's like the form can basically render out into a Django template, just like this number two here. And Django will unroll this form into something that looks like number three, except for email, it'll be color. And then you hit save. You can have an on submit trigger and all of that all that jazz, right? And so Django will take care of all of your validations and everything under the hood. Now, if you wanted to have another components on or equivalent of the component on the page that says that, hey, basically I want to show a list of colors on the page, you just need a query set being passed into the template. Let's just say that that's the colors over here, and it can be unrolled into basically a list-like element, and that could be your template that shows the colors. Uh, Now, the benefits of this is, akin to the locality of behavior philosophy. The closer together things are, the easier they are to implement and understand. And if a programmer looks at a small portion of the code and they can understand it, then that system is inherently more maintainable. Moving on, let's just go into 2009. We're not in the early 2000s anymore. And now, if you wanted to do something similar inside React, you would have to design a component, right? You have this render thing going on at the bottom. You have basically, this change event that's happening when the value changes on the component. And that value basically can be set into the state, which can be on the component itself. And then whenever you want to submit your form data, there would be an network call being made. You'd be filling inside the implementation on line 14 onwards inside the handle submit method. And then when you get the value back, you might have another component, you know, that that you also need to update basically by having, maybe two components on the same page. And then, so you might have something above it that, that maintains the state. And, you kind of like would have to, on a common parent, I think that's what they call it. And then you would have two components built in this way. And then you'd have to kind of like think about all of your data refresh scenarios. What happens if, how do you keep everything up to date? How do these components interact with each other? And it's like, what's the kind of the central event pass that kind of like determines everything. So one option is to basically use this central state to manage everything. The other option is basically to use a flux or redux pattern to basically be able to manage state for you. Now the pros and cons, the pro of this React style way of doing things, which is modern web development, is that we are avoiding full page reloads. We have components which didn't exist before, and one could argue that they don't exist inside a lot of frameworks. And it's like you can have complicated state management because it's like running the equivalent of a message queue on the front end. That's what Flux and Redux are like. And then, it's like you can also have service workers, and you can actually have an offline mode on your application, and you can have the application functioning. So for example, you might have a note-taking app that you can perfectly write notes to using local storage, and then when you come back online, maybe it synchronizes to the server. The cons, the biggest con here is, less batteries and more complexity. Also the performance, because, you kind of like React is a very, very big, bulky thing that has a huge startup time. And then, it's like you also have issues propping up like security concerns, cross-site validation stuff. You have, auth. So, how do you handle it? You kind of like have to think about auth and everything around that. You've got slow build times, and these are some of the cons that kind of like come up with React. What does HTMX do? Now, let's just assume that basically we could, you know, have some magic attributes that we could sprinkle onto our HTML and Django implementation that we showed before. And, by way of which we could instruct the client and the server and to kind of like play and get things done. What would that look like? Over here on the button, there's this basically HX post that has a URL inside it, which lists, a route, and it also contains a few other things like here's basically the target of whatever the response needs to go to this target, which is an ID inside the DOM, and then your swap behavior, which is that replace the inner HTML. So implementing this, what it does is that it um, will make an ajax call. When you hit the button, it would submit the form's contents. Now the server would return a partial containing the list of elements, the colors list, which would basically be HTML at that point. This HTML would then go to this list ID colors list, and the contents would swap. So you can see lines 2 to 4. That's the initial render. The colors are coming through. The color query set is coming through the template, and it's being unrolled. However, the button, what it's doing is that through this hx post action, it's doing it's basically making an ajax request, getting the response, and it's injecting it into the DOM. And and now all of a sudden you've got a dynamic application which is very simple to understand and simple to implement without getting into front end JavaScript implementation. Similarly, like what happened, like if you want to do stuff like you want to keep the client up to date, in order to implement a polling like pattern, you can have this hx trigger thing, and you can say that, hey, basically do a get on this endpoint every 1 seconds. And that trigger is the thing that would basically that trigger would run the HX guest every 1 second, and then you can kind of like point out the destination, and maybe the client would keep polling against the server every second and injecting the contents into it. This is pretty lightweight, but if you wanted to make it even more lightweight, where if you want the server to notify via SSE push to the client, this is, these are new HTTP protocols for server-sent events. It's very lightweight. You can, have this SSE connect thing and an SSE swap primitive, and all of a sudden the front end would respond to it. Another option we have is basically for WebSockets, and with WebSockets, the implementation is similar, and we'll get into that into a bit. The pros of this are basically that all of a sudden we've got interactivity, which is very lightweight, and we have got simple primitive systems are easier to understand. The cons are that if you've got very stateful apps with very complicated state management thing, cascading changes, Google Sheets, that kind of stuff, then it's not the right solution. And also the ecosystem is very nascent. Another con might be basically that it's like all of a sudden you've got like a lot of composed encapsulated components available in a lot of different front-end libraries. You don't necessarily have them here, and how those components would look like, it's very much a work in progress. So, from 2004, we had this very, very simple, request response loop, basically your traditional MVC architecture. This became very complicated inside 2019 with, React Angular. And now we kind of like coming back to a world which is simplicity first, which is great. Now let's talk a little bit about, the components. The first thing are basically the attributes, right? You can have get, post, uh, you can have patch, you can have hx delete, that kind of like emit ajax requests. You can have hx triggers, like that 1 second trigger. This could also be basically a keyboard press, a button press, stuff like that. Hx swap is the behavior with which the content gets swapped into the DOM, and hx target is where in the DOM the contents get swapped. Similarly, you can have events. Now, there are two types of events inside HTMX. One is basically native events. You can actually have event listeners sniffing into whatever HTMX is doing. So, for example, after a request, that's an event, and you'd be able to look at its the contents, and take some action on top of that. And similarly, it's like this can also do stuff like animations, and you can kind of like get a very, very rich customized UX experience. I don't think a majority of people will go that far. um, and then another type of events are, which we saw before, were SSE events, where you can kind of like have server generated events, and you can kind of like sniff into them just like we did before on this slide. So with the SSE events, you can kind of like say, you can kind of like just say that, hey, when a color update event comes in, the event will basically contain a body, which is basically a HTML partial. And that's kind of like how everything will work. Now, moving on, we also have something called response headers, which are pretty awesome. So, for example, the server can instruct the browser what to do. So, if the server wants to instruct the browser to do a client-side redirection, there's an HX location header that the server can respond to the browser with. Similarly, if the server wants to push something inside local history, the stuff that the back button interacts with, the server can send an hx push url inside the response header. So you can get all of that back and forwards behavior, smart back and forwards kind of behavior, which is a big thing inside front end development, that you want to work nicely with the browser primitives. Now we will talk about a couple of use cases or patterns that I have encountered myself. So the first pattern over here is lists with action buttons. Now this is basically it's like it's the staple of a lot of user interface, especially admin kind of stuff. You might have an employee leave management system. Now we love our colors here, so we're restricting our example to our color form. Let's say that you've got a delete button that can edit the row and dynamically refresh the table. Now, of course, it's like before we saw a template of how we can do it, but let's try to basically think about it with Django batteries. So Django has this really cool third-party library called Django Tables, where we can kind of like attach a table to a model, and all of a sudden you can expose the fields off of that table, and then you can inject new fields as well. The field that we're discussing in this example is the delete action. And you can see in here, I've got a URL column where I can basically extract. I can basically, it's like have a extract URL method, which is, composing the delete URL using this method. And everything else are basically inside this TD actors are, style elements being injected. So if I hit the delete button, what it will do is that it would basically throw out a model saying, "Are you sure?" And it's only when you press yes that it will make an HX get. Actually, this should have been HX delete. I mean, HX get can also work, but HX delete is probably the better REST method. It will make an HX call to the extract URL. It will perform the delete. It will get the response body, and then it's like it would inject it to the target, which is closer to the TR that it originated from. So TR is table row. The closest thing up in the hierarchy would be the table body or the table itself. And then the contents of the table or the table body will get swapped with, what I'm assuming is a bunch of TRs. So all of a sudden now, if we move towards a complete implementation, the next steps are, hey, I need a table view where this query set gets served from, and I need to be able to inject it inside my template by the way of this render table primitive that comes from Django tables. And then, of course, you can have filters and a lot of other goodies that work with it, right? And this is an example of, a customized table, so it doesn't have to really look ugly. So, you can build really quick reusable UIs, and then at the bottom you can see this pagination controller that could be its own component, or it could come back inside a partial, maybe through an SSE event. Maybe you have everything inside the same template and everything refreshing together. All of this stuff is pretty lightweight, and the performance penalty that you're actually getting over JSON with compression is maybe 0.1% or 1%. HTML is pretty efficient. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about are, what about legacy apps? When we're building something new, that these kind of patterns we can use. Some patterns we want to use with legacy apps. There are a lot of legacy apps that were built on Django that have been deployed in the wild. And, in order to do that, Rails has this very, very interesting thing where it can perform body swaps. If you just turn a feature flag on inside the Ruby on Rails equivalent settings file. And over here, inside HTMX, we've got the mechanism for something similar that's available via HX Boost. When we turn HX Boost to true, all of a sudden, all of our hrefs, so for example, we might have a nav bar with a couple of navigation items. Let's say that we have a pet store with a puppies tab and a kittens tab, and now when you click puppies, what would normally happen is that the browser would then basically open up the puppies URL, which would then replace the page. However, loading up the head section again and again is the costly thing. And with HX swap enabled, what it would do is that this href will turn into an Ajax call, and when you get the body back from the server, it will get injected in place of the body. So all of a sudden, you have a legacy app that's uh, working very, very far. It's Ajax-C, and this is the nice way to basically boost legacy apps. Now, the next thing that I'd want to show you is a couple of examples. So the first example, actually before we get into the chat example, I can kind of like show you something that's simpler. So for example, it's like this is an HX table. If I get into something in here, I can have an example that contains some inputs. So, I can kind of like have, what is it? I can kind of like have a key value thing, and then I can kind of like write an expression. Actually, this is not, I will just navigate 1 second. Right. So another benefit is that, I can use this session for a whole lot of stuff. So if I go into the rule sets in here, is monkey is not frozen. Okay, so I will just open up the monkey rule set. So, if I wanted to basically open up any of these, and if I wanted to load up an example, so, I can kind of like have something like this, and I can, live eval JSON. So, this is basically just a UI that was just made inside Bootstrap because I'm not very good with any of that CSS stuff. However, you can have stuff like uh, phone numbers, and you can kind of like have an array, and you can kind of like extract the type from those phone numbers. And all of this stuff is actually making, Ajax calls and basically replacing the DOM. So, this stuff is super fast. Uh, you know, uh, and then, it's like another thing, example of, uh, that event stuff could be, for example, you might go into this rules tab. Actually, yeah, forget about it. But the thing is that, it's like you can actually also, use events and introspect that kind of stuff. Moving on to basically the chat example. Yeah, so about the chat app, so, a couple of some time ago, there was a friend of mine who kind of like was contacted by this industrialist, and he wanted to explore the idea of building an app that was going to be used by his staff. Now, it was a big textile company, and they would reach out to multiple vendors over WhatsApp, and that's how business was done in that part of the world. And then WhatsApp unveiled its chat-like interfaces. You can kind of like have WhatsApp programmatically. However, you still want everything to be on a server, and there were multiple emerging options. So we just wanted to POC something, and we just wanted to build something where you can kind of like around around something. It's like I want to purchase something. You can make a chat group for that. You can send a link out to different people, and they can kind of like take part inside that conversation. Uh, and all of a sudden, you might end up procuring something through this WhatsApp group. So that was the kind of the use case. And I just wanted to throw out a quick and dirty POC in one afternoon. And, you can kind of like have something very vanilla inside Django. And, you can have stuff like different vendor orders. And inside a vendor order, you can, open up chat window, right? And you can see that this interface, like I've opened up two of these, but just to show you, that dynamic stuff, I'm typing in hello and I hit enter, and this is something that, it's just a simple Bootstrap interface. All of a sudden, you got this hello event somewhere else, and this is all WebSockets, and this is using Django channels inside the background. So, this is a super, super easy to pump out demo, and let's see how it works. So if I go back to the slide deck, there's a chat consumer, and what it looks like is that it, sends messages via the WebSocket uh, back to all of the clients. So this is kind of like, the server gets a chat message and it broadcasts it, and everything on the back end is inside Django channels, pretty easy to follow. Then, it's like inside the chat room itself, you've got something like the chat button, which is making HX connection to the chat room. And then on the submit, what it's doing is that it's just taking the contents of the form, and it's throwing it into the endpoint. And that's kind of like what's happening on the client side. And then on the server side, there's just this kind of partial where, when the message is coming back to the client, it's going at right before the end of the content div, and it's injecting, this div as, the last message inside the page. So it's not much more complicated than that. So, it's really simple, basic building something quite powerful. Now let's look at, HTMX being used by the bigger guys. Context is a platform that, a custom collaborative editor for journalists inside France. You can see over here, they get this view of things, and, they can highlight and they can comment and they can, um, add information on various different articles. And this user interface, started off as a React app. It was very interactive, and they ported it to HTMX and Django from Django plus React. And there is some view of the numbers, which you can investigate more deeply through this link. The load times increased considerably down from 6 seconds to 2 seconds. That's basically because React has a very, very high initial startup time, but then also some very interesting things like time to interactive with 3,000 items. Basically, React just couldn't do it, whereas HTMX did it inside 2 seconds. And time to interactive for 50 items on the same view was 2 seconds versus it came down to 1 second for 2 seconds. And the memory footprint also halved approximately. Now going down further, there's also the team was also impacted. So there was no such thing as server only devs anymore. Every dev became a full stack dev, and all of a sudden you can manage this thing with 25% fewer resources based on this stuff. And this is not an exact science for sure. uh, and then, it's like what's the most profound thing is basically the lines of code. So you can see that the number of Python lines of code basically might have increased by, uh, double, like maybe 2.2x, something like that. Whereas the number of lines of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript reduced by 15,000 lines, which is considerable. The number of JavaScript dependencies went down maybe 8 times, and the sub dependencies went down to maybe what is it, maybe 5%, something like that. And the build time kind of like dropped by 8, which is fantastic from performance based thing, because now all of a sudden you don't have to wait for an npm build anymore. And yeah, that's about it. One more thing that I kind of like wanted to cover was autocomplete. Just as we talked before, you can build it very, very easily using ajax trigger with key up, and then you can run a search based on the form input and inject that back into the DOM. So super easy primitives. And if you'd like to find out more about me, you can scan this QR code or you can add me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much.
I have the second mic working again. So does anyone want to ask a question?
I was wondering if you had some experience, perhaps in applications where you don't really want to go like full single page React, but you have more complex behavior than what HTMX supports out of the box. How do we now get into a state where your custom behavior looks like jQuery spaghetti? Like, can you have like more standard components, but then tell HTMX to how to handle them?
So that's there are a lot of things around this, and so for example, Carl Gibson is the guy who put Django forms, or basically one of those Django form libraries. And the thing is that when you're working on partials, it's like you can kind of like you can have a lot of templates that can kind of like spread all over the place. So here's this nifty little library that is made where you can define where the partial starts and ends inside your template. And then basically, when you're rendering your template out, you can basically render it using hash partial. And so kind of like design patterns are emerging. And then if you see the talk that was given by the people who made that other basically website, that the React to HTMX port, they also use something I think called Django View Component. There are a few Django View Component libraries that basically encapsulate those kind of behaviors a little better. So yeah, like I think that there are solutions for that. Yeah.
Okay, it's mostly driving the interaction server side, right?
Yeah, but that's the thing. The server needs to take control. There are some crazy people that have kind of like, they have a version of, they have some code running inside. What is it? Offline workers, and it's like they can kind of like have offline functionality inside HTMX by intercepting calls to offline workers and stuff like that. That's overkill. It's probably fun, but overkill.
Thank you.
Cool. More questions?
I'm also curious to kind of like, if there are any like front enders or some people who have done a lot of front end development, what do they think about this? And, do they think is it worth using sometimes? And like, also curious, show of hand, like, it's like, have I convinced some of you guys to try out HTMX? Like, exactly.
Kevin, maybe you? Yeah, Kevin is a front-end engineer.
Yeah, basically, I think I'm the only front-end engineer, but yeah. So with HTMX, like I've heard of it like for a while now, because well, I mean, I used to follow like front-end news. So what is it like on HTMX that is like already built inside HTMX alongside what is it like the templating, like do they also support like different things like like the reason like why like I think well most people say like it's overkill, but the way that I see it is that React has like a lot of libraries because there are like a lot of like use case scenarios, and I see HTMX as like if you want to build simple things, I think HTMX is like a really good use case scenario. But yeah, I see. But like, oh, okay. Right. And also like, well, I mean, I assume that there's also like JavaScript, like you can just put like a pure JavaScript on top of it, and you can like, does it also like support like TypeScript and things like that?
Pure JavaScript project.
Mhm.
But then again, you could probably have it like same project that you're using in HTMX when you're using that something. There's another kind of like thing that I think so that right now we have this like little, for example, it's like, so one really cool thing is that basically when I select something in here, basically, I can use sessions and like just across the page. So, it's like, another thing is in here, like I can kind of like, do this. And this here is basically something for Google. So like I can kind of like small program. Like that's like, this is a little like library that's used to teach,
programming, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So yeah, so it's like this is kind of like this thing where I'm kind of like using a third-party library, and then it's like using that event
Yeah.
So this library that does this selector and like float with this flow logic is open source.
Yes. Yeah, it's basically used teaching some computer science work. So I kind of like wanted to give underwriters an interface where they can build like credit tools, right? And the good thing here is that when they want to change the age, they just inside this code, and then they can basically put in app ID or select examples, like test, evaluate the results in here, right? I can kind of like inject both my variables dynamically that are available to the evaluation environment. These are the same
same variable that we would take right? And then basically, I kind of like have other pages where I can evaluate all of the rules against my application. I can backtest and generate an Excel sheet, right? And this basically, this system kind of like replaced the system Expedient, which was costing the company $500,000 a year. And this kind of like one week of it. So it's like I think that it kind of like is back in their ability that you don't have to shy away from finance and internal rules. And to be honest, like if somebody comes and implements it inside React and makes it super dynamic, beautiful, the POC has been proven, so that value has been unlocked.
Yeah, I personally see like HTMX is still like super useful, especially like for backenders who doesn't really like want to deal with like a lot of front end. Because I mean, based on my experience, it can be super complex and exhausting at times. Yeah.
We moved to Charlotte, right? Content engineers and moving more into backend. We started using our tool set. This is our way to kind of, to content.
Yeah.
And in React, you can use rendered templates, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, at least like, for front-end engineers, like they are trying to like move into like server-side rendering because like, it's a lot of like less context switching, I would say. Because like I can see like, for someone who just started like programming on React, it's like a lot of things that you need to learn, right? And with HTMX, I can see like, if you already have like background on like Django, just add a little bit of it, like, just templating, and basically it just works. So yeah, I find this library is quite nice to have. Thanks.
More questions?
Once, when twice, when twice,